Welcome, everyone, to the first episode of the Biologic Podcast, Remastered. Biology is the study of life and living things. So, what is life? We are all living things, as are most of the things around us, like grass, trees, birds, moss, fungus, cats, dogs, other people. It's all alive. It's all living stuff. Us humans, as well as all other living things, are like the sensory particulates of the universe. Life is the perpetuation of chemical superstructures that live their lives spread all across the crust of a planet, eating and consuming one another for sustenance. The fundamental elements of the cosmos, like carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, phosphorus, all of these and more are all integral to the living chemical superstructures. Living organisms will cycle atoms within their bodies as they metabolize and grow, and when they die, they'll return their atoms to the greater totality of life itself. In this way, life appears to be an emergent property of matter when kept under specific chemical circumstances. When the temperature and the pressure allows liquid water, when the salinity and the pH isn't poisonously extreme, when nutrients are present and sustainable, then life can thrive. We've seen organic chemicals form in labs under controlled conditions. We've seen organic chemicals on asteroids and in the tails of meteors. We've seen organic chemicals in the water geysers coming out of Enceladus. Given enough time and the right conditions, these organic chemicals might grow into fully fledged cellular life and evolve as individuals compete for limited resources. The growth, behavior, and death of uncountable organisms perpetuates the ecology, the biomes, and ultimately the planet's entire biosphere. Life is a self-perpetuating tide of carbon compounds that form massive chemical superstructures as bodies. And these bodies, be they microscopic chemical capsules like bacteria and archaea, or the macroscopic superstructures like plants, fungus, and animals, all of this carbon-based life has saturated the near entirety of the surface of our world. Our planet's crust is almost entirely carpeted in life. The crust is barren only where there's a lack of water. Life cannot easily tolerate a lack of water, so it follows that the most barren places are also the driest places, like the hot deserts that get punished by the sun, and the frozen ice caps of Antarctica and the Arctic Circle, which have extremely low biodiversity and density of species. We're familiar with Earth life because it surrounds us, but we really have a very limited idea about what kind of exotic biochemistry could exist on an alien planet. We have a sample size of 1, the Earth, and as far as we can tell, there's only one known lineage of biochemicals, and it's the RNA, DNA-based carbon compound biochemistry that we see on the planet all around us, that we are made of. We simply don't know what kind of life could exist out there. Because of the incomprehensible size of the universe, and thus the non-zero probabilities for the planetary conditions necessary for life, we can say with an informed, near certainty that alien life is out there, somewhere. Most likely as microbes, perhaps complex animals. Alien life might also include a species, or more than one, of sapient stargazing beings that look up at their night sky and wonder what kind of life could exist out there on planets orbiting other stars, beyond the limits of their world and their solar system. Given the sheer vastness of the universe, it's probable that there are many billions, likely trillions of Earth-like planets, scattered across billions of galaxies. Each of them could be, or currently does, host a lineage of biochemistry that, because of similar chemical environments, might share properties with life on Earth. By shared properties, I mean the GTCA format of genetic information storage, analogous processes for photosynthesis or cellular respiration, or similar amino acid and protein structures. If an alien world had similar conditions to life on the early Earth, as well as roughly similar quantities of the necessary element resources, it's logical to theorize that the emergent biochemistry could be similar in form and function to our own terrestrial biochemistry. We might have shared nucleic acid molecules, shared carbohydrates, or proteins, or cellular structures. Or they might be wildly different than us, right down to the biochemicals in their cells, and we'll learn a valuable lesson about the raw plasticity of carbon compounds as building blocks for life. It's also possible that animated, self-replicating matter could develop in a really wide variety of environments, with a wide variety of initiating factors. This possibility leads me to think that the galaxy would be teeming with life, as life could originate and develop in a far greater variety of planetary environments than just the select few that happen to resemble the Earth. Try and think of this as like a metaphor with the light spectrum. If we consider the whole spectrum of light, the vast majority of it, like the light frequencies beyond ultraviolet and beyond infrared, we can't see them. We can't see this light. You can think of these light frequencies like planets that can't host life. They're too hot, or too cold, or too dry, or whatever. They can't host life. Now we have the visible light frequencies, and these are the planets that can potentially hold life. If life can form in a wide variety of conditions, if this is our starting hypothesis, then when someone says that life will only emerge on a strictly Earth-like planet, that's like saying that only blue light can be seen. But we understand that there's more frequencies than just blue light. We can see more than just blue light. Just as we might one day understand that there's more possible permutations of life than just Earth-like life in an Earth-like environment. If potentially self-replicating biochemistries could be initiated by a variety of factors, then it's probable that most emergent biochemistries would not resemble Earth life at all, as the chemicals are not adapting to or working in an Earth-like environment. So what could this alien biochemistry be like? Does it store genetic information in nucleotide bases like Earth life? Or does it have an entirely different method of storing their genetic information? Does this alien life have cells that metabolize nutrients like us? Does the alien biochemistry even form structures that we could identify as cells in the first place? Until we discover alien life, we will not know the answers to these questions. We can't even be sure that we'll recognize alien life as life when or if we discover it. In the future, when we're exploring other planets and moons, either in our solar system or in other solar systems, we might find something that's just so alien that it disrupts our psychological understanding of the dichotomous axiom that is life and non-life. We might find something so alien that we can't define it as living or non-living, and it revolutionizes our understanding of life from this dichotomous axiom into some kind of gradient. This all sounds like it could quickly get out of hand and become really complicated. So how do the biologists, the scientists, how do they define life? What distinguishes living matter from non-living matter? Throughout the centuries of study, people have tried to define the qualities of living matter that distinguish it from non-living matter. And while there's debate about the finer points and details, scientists have generally developed 5 broad qualia for identifying life. These are access to energy, some kind of cellular organization, chemically encoded heritable information, the physiological capacity for replication, and the capacity for adaptation in response to evolutionary and environmental pressures. To start at the top of that list, we have energy. Energy is what organisms must obtain and metabolize to sustain their internal biochemistry and keep themselves alive. Autotrophs, like plants, get their energy by capturing a passively available energy source, like sunlight. Heterotrophs are organisms that get their energy by eating and digesting the bodies of other organisms. They break down the tissue in the other organism's body and derive their chemical energy from that. These two cases, autotrophs and heterotrophs, apply to pretty much all multicellular life. But there are single-celled extremophile chemotrophic bacteria that live on the ocean floor, getting energy through the oxidation of inorganic chemicals like ammonia or hydrogen sulfide. In whichever case, the acquired energy is used to maintain the internal homeostasis of the organism and to fuel the growth and cellular respiration of their cells and their tissues. This takes me to cells, which are the fundamental building blocks of life on Earth and the second major qualia that scientists use to define life. The cell is the smallest self-replicating unit within an organism, producing or directly composing every tissue and organ in its body. Cells provide specialized functions to the organism, and they allow it to sense its environment in a granular way and to respond to specific stimuli, like an epithelial cell in the intestines that absorbs food, or a cone cell in the eye that allows for the perception of color, or a nerve cell which activates a muscle or perceives heat on the skin. The cell theory, developed in the first half of the 19th century, formalizes the role of cells in living organisms. I'll get into more detail about the cell theory shortly, as it's really important. It's one of the two most fundamental theories within the entire field of biology. The next broad qualia of life is information. Information exists in the form of a biochemical codex, used to build and maintain the organism's body. Earth life uses a genetic code built into molecules of deoxyribonucleic acid, or DNA. The information within DNA is transcribed and translated into the proteins that literally build and maintain the tissues composing the organism's body. DNA also works externally through epigenetic changes like methylation that can regulate where and when specific genes can get expressed. Without some kind of organized, accessible chemical information, there can be no real biological organization. There can be no chemical coordination of growth. This aspect of information in living things is what separates smelly, decomposing lumps of wet carbon compounds with the sophistication of chemically organized, self-replicating life forms. Replication on a cellular, individual, and population level is also necessary for life to perpetuate itself. As an organism grows, its body ages and wears out, eventually succumbing to cancers, or cellular senescence, or whatever it is that causes life to age. By reproducing, the organism generates new individuals who can live beyond their parents and produce offspring of their own. An organism can multiply and spread its genes out across geographic space, the genes themselves encapsulated in the cells of new generations of individuals. This also perpetuates its genes through time. Because of replication carrying life through time into modernity, you represent the tip of a branch on the tree of life, which reaches back through your parents and your ancestors, and the ancestors of the human species and of mammals and of vertebrates, all the way back to the first self-replicating cells, which are the common ancestor of all life on Earth. The last major point is adaptation, or adaptability. This is the capacity of a population of organisms to change over time in response to various selection pressures in their environment. It's basically the capacity for a species to evolve. This change happens over very long periods of time, as the phenotypes that can operate best in a given environment are maintained, while phenotypes that operate poorly or inefficiently will die off, they'll be culled. In this way, the totality of the population becomes more and more adapted to their environment. This is a fundamental aspect of the theory of evolution, which is the second of the two fundamental theories within biology. So there we have it. 5 qualities that help define life: the use of energy, cellular organization, heritable information, replication, and adaptation. Although some definitions also like to specify the ability to undergo growth, the ability to respond to environmental stimuli, and the ability to conduct metabolic processes. But I'm generally inclined to think that these can be included in the 2 original points of needing and using energy and having a body composed of cells. So now that that's covered, I should address the 2 fundamental theories that I mentioned earlier. Cell theory describes the properties and functions of cells, and how they cooperate to form tissues, and thus entire organisms. The theory of evolution describes the processes by which speciation occurs, that is, how a species evolves through time, and how new species can emerge by branching off of their ancestor species. Together, cell theory and evolutionary theory provide the bedrock of data upon which the entirety of modern biological science has flourished. Cell theory was developed in the early 19th century by 2 German scientists, the physiologist Theodor Schwann and the botanist Matthias Schleiden. Schwann had studied nerve and muscle tissues under the microscope, where he discovered the neural cell that would be named after him. Schleiden studied plant tissue and the role of the nucleus in cell division. He published the book Contributions to Phytogenesis in 1838, where he explained how cells originate from other cells, and how these cells compose every part of a plant and direct its growth. In that same year, both men authored and published the microscopical researches into the accordance and the structure and growth of animals and plants, a massive tome which formalized the knowledge of the time into the first cell theory. Their initial cell theory had three primary tenets. All organisms are composed of one or more cells. The cell is the basic unit of organization and structure. And cells arise from pre-existing cells. Over time, the theory was developed as better microscope, sampling, and imaging technology became available. For example, Schwann and Schleiden originally described the interior of a cell as a jelly-like protoplasm, which is now understood to be a watery, protein-rich solution called the cytoplasm. In 1877, the botanist Wilhelm Pfeffer put forward the membrane theory, suggesting that the exterior physiology of the cell is characterized by a semi-permeable membrane. The details and specific functions of a membrane would be contested for decades as more and more research was compiled, eventually developing into the modern understanding of the cell membrane as a fluid lipid bilayer studded with proteins. In 1935, Carl Lohmann discovered ATP, a very important compound that provides a bioavailable energy source for cells. This discovery of a quantifiable energy molecule really opened the door for what was considered possible, introducing ideas like dynamic equilibrium, membrane potentials, and ATP-powered ion pumps. The modern cell theory has several new tenets added to the original three. These new tenets are: the total activity of all cells influences the activity of the organism. Energy flow occurs within cells. Cells contain DNA in the chromosomes and RNA in the cytoplasm and the nucleus. All the cells in an organism share a similar chemical composition. So beyond the basic tenets of the cell theory, it's understood that there are two fundamental types of cells. The first type are called prokaryotes, which encompasses the domains bacteria and archaea. Prokaryotes are small cells with many circular loops of DNA called plasmids. They don't have a nucleus or any membrane-bound organelles, they just have ribosomes. The second type of cells are called eukaryotes, which comprise a single domain called eukarya, or the eukaryotes. You, your parents, your friends, me, my parents, my friends, all the people around us, as well as virtually every living thing that you can see with your naked eye, like a tree or a dog, they're all eukaryotes. Eukaryotes, like us and trees and dogs, are characterized by larger cells that have organized chromosomes within a nucleus, outlined by a nuclear membrane, as well as a complex internal infrastructure of membrane-bound organelles. The theory of evolution was developed and formalized in the mid-19th century by the English naturalist Charles Darwin. Darwin was born to a wealthy family, getting his education at the University of Edinburgh Medical School and Christ College, Cambridge, where he developed an intense fascination with beetle collecting. Shortly after graduating, Darwin came upon the chance to join the crew of the HMS Beagle. The ship left port in December 1831, heading around South America where it visited the Galapagos Islands. It was here, at the Galapagos Islands, that Darwin made the famous observations that would inspire him to formulate the theory of evolution by natural selection. He noticed that more offspring were born than could ever hope to survive, given the finite available resources, and that this dire state of affairs initiated a competition for survival. Darwin noticed how subgroups of a particular genus would show slight variations correlating to the islands that they came from. Finches had beaks of varying size and strength, each seemingly adapted to the available nuts and seeds on their home island. During his voyage, Darwin kept meticulous notes. He was really intent on recording everything he could, on taking meticulous notes and drawings of his dozens and dozens of sampled species. In addition to the fieldwork, he wrote numerous letters to friends, to family, and to academic peers about his findings, which were mailed whenever the Beagle came to a port city. Darwin's research was electrifying the scientific community back in Europe, giving him a quasi-celebrity status. After compiling the data collected across nearly 30 years of work, Darwin published his famous book, On the Origin of Species, on the 22nd of November, 1859. Since Darwin's time, the theory of evolution has been greatly refined, especially in the last 60 years due to the development of modern technology. The theory of evolution has three primary tenets. Physical traits will vary among individual members of a population. This is phenotypic variation. The differences in these traits influence rates of survival and reproduction. This is to say that an organism with particular traits that help it survive and reproduce in some environment will have a high fitness. These traits are heritable, and they can be passed on to future generations. Evolution is thus the gradual change in the ratio of particular genetic traits in a population. Here's a few examples of that process in action. Consider a population of mice living in a brown, grassy field. These mice have white or brown fur, depending on a particular gene. Mice with brown fur are better able to hide and camouflage themselves in the dry brown grass of the field. On the other hand, mice with white fur will stand out. Predators will be able to see them easier, and the predators will be able to hunt them easier and kill them easier. This predation is a selection pressure against white fur, against having white fur, because having white fur lowers the individual's fitness. Because the brown fur mice are more likely to survive and reproduce than the white fur mice, the next generation of mice will have a higher proportion of brown fur than it will individuals with white fur. If this trend continues, the traits will go to fixation, and the gene for white fur will die out completely, while the gene for brown fur will be present in 100% of the currently living individuals in the current generation. The mice population has evolved purely brown fur. For another example, consider a population of lizards living in a jungle. These lizards live in a lowland area characterized by insect-filled swamps to the west and trees with tasty fruit to the east. The lizard population is spread out across the whole lowland area, and they eat from both food sources. Until one day, a river erodes its banks and spills into the lowland. The river floods the habitat and splits it in half, and the lizard population is bisected into two groups, one on the west side of the new river and the other on the east side. The lizards on the west side of the river can now only get food from the swamps. They can't cross the river, so they have to hunt insects while traversing their wet, boggy, swampy environment. The lizards on the east side of the river can now only get their food from the fruit-bearing trees. They must be able to climb trees and avoid predators that are sharing the canopy. The first group is experiencing a selection pressure for good hunting skills to hunt the insects, carnivorous teeth to eat the insects, and better movement in aquatic and semi-aquatic environments because they live in a swamp. Meanwhile, the second group is experiencing a selection pressure going in a totally different direction. They're experiencing selection pressures for camouflage to hide from the predators, and for an improved climbing ability so that they can quickly move throughout the tree canopy. If the river stays in this area long enough, and the two groups of lizards are isolated long enough, their respective selection pressures will create and then widen a genetic gap between them. Eventually, the two groups will be so genetically different that they won't be able to interbreed to produce fertile offspring anymore. Even if the river dries up and they come back together, if they're too genetically separated, if they were separated for too long, they won't be able to remerge. They won't be able to come back together with fertile hybrids. In effect, the river altered the environment of the original lizard population, causing them to split and diverge into two new species. While making observations in the Galapagos Islands, Darwin noticed that finches had different sizes and shapes of beak depending on the island that they came from. He noted that the beak traits seemed related to the available food sources on their home islands. Finches with small beaks, such as the Geospiza parvula, lived on an island rich in small, soft seeds that were relatively easy to open. A small beak could easily crack open these seeds, and that would have made a large beak disadvantageous. A large beak would take more resources to grow, and it would impair the bird's handling of the small, delicate seeds. Other finches, such as the Geospiza magnirostrus and the Geospiza fortis, lived on islands where the only available seeds were really big, or they were encased in a hard shell. As a result, these finches evolved large, powerful beaks to break open the shells and get to the food inside. The individuals on these islands with small, weak beaks were thus unable to crack open enough seeds to feed themselves, and they would have starved and died out as they were outcompeted by the individuals with larger, stronger beaks. The study of biogeography observes the geographical distribution of various species, and compares the genetic relatedness of species with their geographic proximity. I have my own little playlist on biogeography. You can check out cool episodes on the biogeography of Beringia, or the Sahara, or Wallacea, or all these other regions around the world. It's kind of interesting. You should check it out. But anyway, in the case of the Galapagos Islands, all the various finches were closely related to one another, and a little less closely related to the finches on the South American mainland, on the mainland continent. In a phenomenon called adaptive radiation, a species colonizes a new area and begins to diversify to fill the available niches in that area, just like the lizards in my second example diversified to adapt to their specific environments. One adapted into the niche of insect predator, while the other adapted into the niche of fruit feeder. As species diversify and adapt to their ecological niches, they undergo speciation. Over hundreds of thousands, over millions, over billions of years, adaptation and speciation has produced a tremendous variety of living things, all related to one another through common ancestors. The common ancestor of humans, chimpanzees, and bonobos, for example, existed about 6 to 7 million years ago. At that time, the common ancestor population split, with one population staying in the trees and the other population descending onto the grassland plains of East Africa. The population that descended onto the plains would have evolved new traits to adapt to their new environment, such as bipedalism, a double-curved column of vertebra, and an upright posture, eventually becoming the human species of the genus Homo. Our ancestral population that stayed in the trees, they would continue to evolve into the genus Pan, and the genus Pan would diverge into chimpanzees and bonobos. This divergence happened very recently, about 8 or 900,000 years ago. If we compile the common ancestors of all species, we can produce the Tree of Life, an elegant, top-down map of the phylogenetic relationships between all living things. If the tips of the highest branches represent all of the currently living species, then the point where two branches join together, or I guess where a branch branches out into smaller branches, that's like a node that represents the common ancestor species of two cousin species. By following the branches going back from the tips towards the trunk, you can visually explore the relationship between species, going back to the very first self-replicating cell, which is represented by the trunk of the Tree of Life itself, or the roots, I guess you could say. And it first appeared on this planet around 3.5 billion years ago. So the Tree of Life represents 3.5 billion years, or maybe more, of evolutionary development and speciation. Taxonomy is the study of this Tree of Life. Or more technically, taxonomy is the study of species as they relate to one another, and the application of this knowledge into naming and classification conventions. Classification of species has existed in an intellectual format as like an intellectual exercise for thousands of years, going as far back as Plato, but was formatted for the modern age by Carl Linnaeus in the 18th century. With the development of modern technology, fields like phylogenetics and systematics have greatly improved and refined the taxonomic understanding of life. First, a bit of vocab. The titular unit of taxonomy is the taxon, which refers to any named group of organisms, like mammals, or crustaceans, or bacteria. A clade refers to a common ancestor and all of its lineal descendants. There are thousands of clades, but I'll get to that in a minute. Fortunately, there are just 8 tiers in the total hierarchical classification of life, with domains being the largest group at the top, the most inclusive of all of these different species, and species at the bottom, which are the least inclusive. So from top to bottom, from most inclusive to most specific, the taxonomic classification goes as follows: domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. There's 3 domains: bacteria, archaea, and eukaryota. Within the domains, there's 6 kingdoms. Kingdom Animalia, Plantae, Fungi, and Protista are all part of the eukaryotes. The Kingdom Archaea and the Kingdom Bacteria belong to their respective domains. Phylums are even more finely tuned. Within the kingdom Animalia, there's 35 phylums. Within the kingdom Plantae, there's 12. And within the kingdom Fungi, there's 7 phylums. Within phylums, there's classes. Within classes, there's orders. Within orders, there's families. Within families, there's genuses. And within genuses, there's individual species. Humans, for example, belong to the kingdom Animalia, the phylum Chordata, the class Mammal, the order Primate, the family Hominidea, the genus Homo, and the species Sapiens. We share the family Hominidea with orangutans, gorillas, chimpanzees, and bonobos. But every other member of our genus, Homo, is extinct. Those once living relatives included the Homo habilis and the Homo neanderthalensis, the latter of which became extinct around 40,000 years ago, and whose DNA is still present to some degree in various human societies today. The taxa that I just mentioned, with humans and chimps and bonobos, is a tribe called Homininae. But what about the next closest cousin, the gorilla? The gorilla is in the tribe Gorillinae, and together with Homininae compose the subfamily Homininea. Now consider the next closest relative outside of the gorilla. It's the orangutan in the genus Pongo in the subfamily Poncinea. Poncinea and Homininea are both in the family Hominidea. It doesn't stop there. The family Hominidea shares the superfamily Hominidoidea. You might know the Homininoidea as their other name, apes. So all of those layers, all of these taxonomic names and families and groups, and we've only gotten as far back as apes. The next major tier is the order, primates. But it isn't that easy. It doesn't go directly from family to order. There's all these intermediate little groups and taxons as well. For example, Homininoidea, the apes, are in the parvorder Chitarinae, defined as the old world primates with downward-facing nostrils. Chitarinae is in the infraorder Simiiformes, or the higher primates, which is itself in the suborder Haplorhini, characterized as the dry-nosed anthropoids. Now we're in the order primates. Primates are in a minor order called Primatomorpha, which they share with another order called Dermatoptera. Dermatoptera is composed of just 2 living species, called Colugo, which are small little creatures that jump and glide with flaps of skin between their legs. The last common ancestor between Dermatoptera and primates is thought to have existed in the Cretaceous period, nearly 80 million years ago. So far on the Tree of Life, we're not even past our tree-dwelling cousins, and I'm taking this all the way back to the first reproducing cells, so buckle up. The Primatomorphia belong to a grand order called Euarchonta, in a superorder called Euarchonta in a magnorder called Boreoeutheria. The word Boreoeutheria has 3 components in its native Greek, meaning north, good, and beast. These good northern beasts are placental mammals with external testicles, and they share a common ancestor that existed about 80 to 100 million years ago. Boreoeutheria are a sister group to Xenarthra, the armadillos and the sloths, in the clade Exafroplacentalia. This clade is a sister group to the Afrotheria lineage, a clade of mammals that originated from and live in Africa, including elephants and aardvarks. Together, Afrotheria and Boreoeutheria share the clade Eutheria, in the subclass Theria. Theria are a clade of mammals that give birth to live young, without the use of eggs. The only mammals not in the Theria clade are monotremes, which are egg-laying creatures like the platypus and the echidna, but they are weird anomalies. Before we get to the class Mammalia, we have to include the infralegion Tribosphenaida, the sublegion Zetheria, the legion Cladotheria, then Trecnotheria, then Holotheria, and now we're at mammals. Think about all of the layers of classification that I just covered, each one including one more lineage that branched off in one more step back through time. There are over 5,400 species of mammals besides humans and our chimp and bonobo cousins. Each one of them has just as complex a genetic history, reaching back 220 million years to this common ancestor of all mammals. This common ancestor is the Therapsida protomammals, or the mammaliaforms, that branched off of the group Sphenodicotodontia, the parent group of all modern reptiles, birds, and mammals. Even farther along the tree of life, there's the phylum Chordata, or animals that have a notochord, which is a cartilage-like mass that typically becomes an intervertebral disc. Chordata includes all fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals, as well as two subphyla of aquatic tube-like animals called Cephalochordata and Tunicata. This whole mess is all a clade within the kingdom Animalia. The common ancestor for the kingdom Animalia came about 542 million years ago during the Cambrian explosion. The most closely related kingdom to animals that isn't some lineages of protists are the fungi. The fungi evolved hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of years ago, and 200 million years before that came the first algal slimes capable of living out of the water. Before this, there was several billion years of evolution on the scale of just single-celled organisms, themselves being the descendants of the first life forms. Organic molecules heated in a primordial swamp in an ashy sky split by lightning would eventually coalesce and become the first cells, the first ancestors of all life on Earth. Biology is the study of that life, of all of the descendants of these first cells that swam through the ancient primordial oceans of the young Earth. Well, that wraps up this first remastered episode of the Biologic Podcast. I hope that I really sparked your interest and fascination in biology, in the biological science, and in the world of living things. If I inspired you to pursue a career in biological sciences, or to start learning more about it, even if I just made you look at living things in a different way, then I did my job. That's what I'm trying to do here with this podcast. If you like this, if you like biology and you enjoy this format, if you enjoy listening to me talk about biology, then subscribe, like my videos, stay tuned. I produce weekly content on new biological topics, and there's just a ton of stuff for you to explore and check out. I'll continue this remastered series in episode 2 on biochemistry, which will explore life on the smallest scale. And as always, thanks for listening. Would you like to support the Biologic Podcast? It's super easy. You can hit the like button, you can share your favorite episodes with your family and friends, and if you aren't subscribed, you should hit the subscribe button to enjoy weekly episodes. If you want to make a financial contribution to the podcast, you can become a patron by signing up at the podcast's Patreon page. You can also peruse cool merchandise in the official Biologic store, which has a ton of hand-designed shirts, hoodies, and stickers. All the links you need are in the description section below.